Hello and welcome to the first in our new series of panel discussions exploring the role of compassion when it comes to new technology. I'm Tegan Taylor, a health and science journalist at the ABC and co-host of the ABC's daily coronavirus podcast, Coronacast. I have the pleasure of hosting these conversations over the next few weeks. On behalf of the University of Queensland, the panellists and the production team, I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the lands from which we are variously connected today. We pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants and recognise the valuable contributions to Australian and global society. I'm sure that every generation thinks that they've seen a lot of change, but honestly, this past 50 years has given pretty much every period in history a run for its money. The technology that powers our world and our interactions today could hardly have been imagined half a century ago. But has it made for a happier and more equitable world? These discussions are going to tackle just that, from the perspective of the human capacity for compassion. You might think you know what compassion means, but for our purposes, let's give ourselves a definition. Here we'll be talking about something distinct from sympathy, feeling sorry for someone, or empathy, experiencing the feelings of others within yourself. Our definition of compassion has two aspects. The first is a sensitivity to suffering and need. The second, a motivation to do something to alleviate that suffering and need. Compassion is not just about feeling, but doing. Today, our conversation will focus on loneliness. Have social media and other digital communication tools brought us closer together or made us more isolated? It's a meaty topic, and to help us explore it, we have three people with three very different perspectives. My first guest is Osher Günsberg. You've probably seen this guy before. Osher is one of Australia's most recognisable media personalities. You might know him from Channel V or Australian Idol or The Bachelor or Bondi Rescue or The Masked Singer Australia. He's a television and radio presenter, journalist and mental health advocate. And he's also a podcaster. He's teamed up with Charlie Clausen to create Dad Pod, a weekly podcast talking about fatherhood. And he's also written a memoir, Back After the Break, about, among other things, living with mental illness. It became an instant bestseller and was nominated for Best Biography of the Year at the 2019 Australian Book Industry Awards. Osher, you're really famous, but paradoxically for you, there's been times when that fame has made you feel even more isolated. How did this happen?
You're right. And when it did happen, I was like, oh no, I'm the guy that I've read about in those books of other famous people when they talk about I was in a room full of people and I'd never felt more alone. I guess there was a time in my life where I was on a television show that was watched by 1 in 4 adult Australians. It was the most popular show that had ever been aired in our country at any time. I was instantly recognizable to nearly every single person I walked past on the street, at the grocery store, wherever I went. And what it led me to feel, I guess, was this overwhelming amount of attention my way. However, each one of the interactions that I had with those people was at the best transactional, at the very least inauthentic. And I would not be able to actually have an actual conversation about anything particularly meaningful or something that was of depth that allowed me to connect with that person. It was almost as if they were speaking to this kind of hyper-real simulacrum of what they thought this television avatar come to life now talking to them. But I would speak to them and not actually be able to find anything like in the immediate communication, the immediate meeting of somebody. And as time went on, they became very isolating and very strange. And over the course of that time, that led to other things along the lines of I used alcohol to manage. It became quite frightening. And I used alcohol to manage some of those interactions to kind of dull the effect of them, I guess, and went through phases of agoraphobia where I would just not leave the house for 3 days at a time or more. It was quite uncomfortable. And the whole time going, what the hell? I'm on this, big TV show and I'm making big TV show pre-GFC money. I shouldn't feel this way, but I was feeling this way. And that was also a big part of it, Tegan. It was quite uncomfortable.
Yeah, that interaction without any real connection. I'm really looking forward to digging into that with you in our discussion, Osher.
Yeah, me too.
My next guest is Catherine Haslam, a professor in the University of Queensland School of Psychology. She explores the impact of identity on mental health and well-being and the importance of building social identities within groups. This work has led to Groups for Health, a tool that helps people manage their social group memberships and aims to help them to build better relationships with others. She's the co-author of the award-winning book, The New Psychology of Health, Unlocking the Social Cure, which explores the role of social identity in both understanding and managing health problems. Catherine, why do you need a program like Groups for Health? Isn't being in social groups just natural?
We developed Groups for Health on the back of probably about a decade of work where we were doing a lot of research looking at the effect of these different groups, community groups. We were running groups in residential care. We were running groups in communities. We were running men's clubs, water clubs. We were running... We had created design teams within residential care where residents were actually involved in developing and changing their own social environment. So it was an environment in which they could connect meaningfully to each other in ways that they wanted to. These were really distinct, and each of these different interventions are very different. So they targeted different activities. But what we actually found in all of them was that they all were associated with increased health outcomes. They enhance mental health, well-being, brain health, cognitive health for some people as well. And so what we learned from that was that it wasn't about any particular intervention. It was really about the group itself. It was when a group provided people with meaning, purpose, and value, that's when we actually saw the health gain. And so what we wanted to do is we wanted to kind of distill that into a program that empowered people to make the most of those groups that exist out there. And there are tons of groups that exist out there in the local community that are supported by the charity and voluntary sector. What we want to do with Groups for Health is we want to help people to make the most of those existing groups, identify the groups that will float their boat, the groups that will really, really work for them, and also to help people who feel or have felt disconnected for some time. And so they feel uncomfortable about connecting and joining with groups. They don't know where to start. This is a program for them. So Groups for Health gives people the knowledge and the skills that they need to build and sustain their group-based connections in ways that support their health and in ways that they feel comfortable and in ways that they can seek and find meaningful bonds.
You've convinced me. It feels like it's more important than ever. Thanks, Catherine. Rounding out today's panel is James Doty. Jim is Clinical Professor of Neurosurgery at Stanford University, Founding Director of the Centre of Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, and Senior Editor of the Oxford Handbook of Compassion Science. He serves on the advisory board to the Fogarty Institute for Innovation and was previously chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation. Not to mention his best-selling book, Into the Magic Shop, a neurosurgeon's quest to discover the mysteries of the brain and the secrets of the heart, has been translated into 31 languages. It inspired an album by BTS, that's a K-pop boy band for the uninitiated, and it's currently in development as a movie with the Oscar-nominated producer Todd Black. So, Jim, Into the Magic Shop isn't just a metaphor. It is a metaphor, but it's not just a metaphor. It's actually something that happened to you that was a turning point in your life. Can you tell us that story?
Just to make a statement, who we are today often has a relationship of our past. And my past was growing up in poverty. My family was on public assistance my entire life. And my father was an alcoholic. My mother had had a stroke when I was a child. And as a result, she was paralyzed, chronically depressed, attempted suicide. We were evicted from multiple residences. And of course, this is not the environment for a child to thrive in. And as a result, you have a lot of fear, anxiety. You don't know where to turn. And on some level, because you're not being nurtured appropriately, you feel very lonely and isolated and hopeless. Now, the beautiful thing and the wonderful thing that happened to me was that I actually, when my home situation would deteriorate, I would get on my bicycle and ride as far away as I could. And on one of those treks, I actually ran into a magic shop, and I had an interest in magic. And at this magic shop, when I walked in, there was a woman who was sitting there reading a book. She had her glasses on the tip of her nose, and she had this long gray hair, and she looked up, and I actually began to query her about some things related to magic. And she laughed and she said, I know nothing about that type of magic. My son owns the store, and I'm just here keeping the store open while he runs an errand. But the extraordinary thing about her was that she had this radiant smile that made me feel safe. And as I'm sure we will hear, being able to create an environment of psychological safety actually decreases one's stress, decreases one's anxiety, which actually allows them to be much more open and communicate. And as a result of our initial conversation, which lasted about 15 or 20 minutes, while she actually, I have to say, was feeding me chocolate chip cookies, she offered actually to meet with me every day for an hour and a half to 2 hours and teach me things that she had learned. And this was, of course, before we had this idea of neuroplasticity or the ability, or this idea of meditation. And over a course of 6 weeks, she taught me these exercises that frankly gave me a tool set that allowed for resilience, acceptance, and actually change the trajectory of my life.
It's incredible how that a critical interaction can really set you on a different path. That's beautiful.
And it's very true. And that's why many people forget that each and every one of us have the capacity to change the life of another person.
Well, let's get into our panel discussion. I want to start with you, Osha. Your experience isn't exactly what most people experience, but the experience of feeling lonely and isolated is. How do you describe that feeling of loneliness?
I think disconnection would be it, and not to understand that I'd never understood that I could feel lonely in a room full of people. That's very odd. That's a very odd thing to feel, because I guess the way I would liken it is if you've ever found yourself in a foreign country with not one word of the language, you can't read a sign, you probably are foreign to any local cultural social cues that delegate, who's, the status of the people in the room, not being able to engage in a conversation. You just kind of stand there and exist in this space full of people and not being able to engage or anything. That's the best way that I could describe it for people who, there's a handful of people that have done that. But I had to work very, very hard. It's not like that now. I still have those encounters with people, but I've learned how to manage it and how to take the lead on those, conversations when people do meet me. But it's a really weird, very, very weird feeling. And to take the analogy, one step further, like what do you do when you're in that foreign country and you do want to connect with people? You start learning, you start figuring out, you try observe, you start trying to figure out how you can connect with people. I have had the experience similarly in the earlier days of the Facebook, when this friends count was just going through the roof, and I just thought to myself, wow, hundreds and hundreds of friends. Like, how many of them would come over and help me move my couch on Saturday? Probably not many. It's this kind of degraded meaning of what that connection is for people. But bear in mind, I'm nearly 50, Tegan, and I watch my eldest. She's almost 18. She's finishing her high school right now, and the permeable nature of her relationship and how it just seamlessly transitions from out of her phone to in real life with her friends, and then back into her phone when she comes back to the house. It's almost like there's no barrier there. So I dare say that at the risk of feeling and sounding old, even though I do have a hip replacement and wear hearing aids, I think I'm just old when I observe young people, and that as they are digital natives, they are much more able to navigate this feeling. I still feel disconnected from people that I'm chatting with online, but that's because I remember what it was to connect with people before that even existed. But as a digital native, she knows no different. And she has developed this entirely different set of abilities to connect and assumptions of tense and meaning and tone when she's reading and engaging with people online that I struggle to comprehend. And she manages it incredibly well.
I did want to pick up on that. Like, Catherine, do we know for sure that loneliness has increased because of technology, or is this just something we're surmising? Can we quantify it?
Yeah, look, I think that there are some people who are actually trying to quantify it. And I think that the evidence out there is a little bit mixed. It depends on which groups you actually talk to. I sympathise here with Osha. I'm in the Luddite space as well, in terms of, in terms of sort of coming on board with technology and learning to use it effectively. What I think is really interesting out there is the fact that even though we have technology, people are still lonely. Okay, so that's telling us that the technology isn't on its own doing the work. And I think that part of that reflects, there's been some feedback from young people in particular. And I thought that something that was really insightful in some of the feedback that's coming in from young people is that, these virtual connections, social media is giving you contact, but not necessarily connection. And I wonder whether that also resonates with you, Osher, in terms of what you were actually describing, that, you weren't, these aren't necessarily in-depth, meaningful, rich connections that you've got. You've got a lot of contacts. What we need to be able to do is we need to be able to shift, make those a little bit more deep and meaningful. We need to move from the contact to making it something that's a real connection that we feel and something that we can actually turn to, and that when we're engaging with it, it is satisfying some of those connection needs that we've got.
Jim, you're a neurosurgeon, not a neuroscientist, but you have looked at this a lot. Can you talk to what's happening in the brain when we're connecting in that virtual way versus what we're doing when we have true personal connection?
Sure. Of course, as we know, there's what we call our sympathetic nervous system, which is our flight, fight, or fear response, which is mediated in the amygdala. And we have our parasympathetic nervous system, which is our rest and digest system, which is oriented in our frontal regions. But what happens is that when one is lonely, and again, as human beings, we're actually have evolved to be very social animals. But if we don't have that connection, then of course this stimulates our sympathetic nervous system, which stimulates fear. It stimulates a whole variety of physiologic effects, which only exacerbate the situation. Because when you're anxious, when you're nervous, it prevents you from having access to this part of our brain called the executive control areas, which we can use experience and memory to understand how to connect, if you will, or not be impaired in our connection. And so when we're stressed and anxious, that has a profound negative effect on our ability to communicate. You made the comment regarding sort of technology. And as was noted by Catherine, of course, technology in many instances has allowed connection, but it also allows separation. And the way it allows separation is that, unfortunately, there is a tendency to want to appear perfect. And there are a whole variety of people who essentially have completely fake appearances and identities, but who want to appear as if that's really them. And of course, then this caters to their own anxiety of inadequacy and this fear of being judged, which then separates them further from the reality of true connection. And it's very sad. It's fascinating, right? When you quiz high school students, a huge percentage of them say they want to be influencers. But if you look at the suicide rates among influencers, it's extraordinarily high because they're not living a true, authentic life, and they're not really truly connecting. As Osher was saying, you're on Facebook and you have all these people who are quote unquote your friends, but you have no relationship to any of them truly, and they don't really know who you are. And this, of course, is this paradox of having all these people who know you, at least by appearance, and then attribute certain characteristics to you, but in fact, they know nothing.
It's sort of like your experience, Osher, but on a smaller scale, isn't it? That fame, in a sense, these people who have a sense of what your life is like, the glamorous version of you that you put out there, but don't necessarily know what's happening in your day-to-day that isn't Instagrammable.
I was doing a live test of Instagram a few years before it was made. But I'm kind of interested to know, maybe Kath and Jim can shed some light on this. I know that in the earlier days of Twitter, for example, which is the one I engaged with the most early on, I could tweet and converse with people all day and have the feeling like I'm connecting. But you'd probably be able to tell me what was going on in my brain, like as far as dopamine goes in that reward system. But it did feel like all I had done was eat potato chips all day. I was full, but it wasn't good for me. Like, how does that? I'd love to know, like, what's going on there when I'm busy all day talking to people online and then go to bed at night still feeling alone?
Go on, experts, answer him.
Well, go ahead, Catherine.
I was going to say, go ahead, Jim, first, because I certainly can't talk about the neurotransmitters, and maybe Jim can actually talk about that. I think it's about how they satisfy you. So, as you said, Osha, before, you can be surrounded by people, but if you don't connect with them, if you don't have a sense of connection or belonging, and this is where our kind of sort of sense of identifying with others, that kind of social self, identifying socially with others, and having that strong sense of connection or bond. How they feed back to you isn't necessarily going to influence or change you. So one of the things that we talk about in our Groups for Health program and try and get people to try and understand is that, look, there's a lot of groups out there, but it isn't the case that just any group is going to do. The only groups that are going to actually have an impact on your health and be able to influence you in some way are those that you identify with, that you connect with, that you feel a bond with. That's what we call social identification with those groups. Because, if they don't matter to you, they're not going to influence the way you think. They're not going to change the way you behave. And so I think that that's possibly a part of what might be going on there, that there are all these contacts that I've actually got out there, but I don't know them. I don't necessarily identify with them or bond with them because I don't know where they're coming from yet. You may in the future if you actually invest and connect with them. But without that, it's actually hard to feel satisfied. It's hard to feel that they're actually going to make a difference or a change in your life.
Jim?
Yeah, well, I think the other aspect of this is this concept of authenticity in connecting with people. As you were pointing out, Catherine, having groups you're not interested in just showing up, you're not going to connect with. Getting back to what Osher was saying about dopamine, these neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin, or oxytocin, and of course, they're in different parts of your brain, but many of them are associated with reward and social connection. And the problem is that these technology companies, they hire actually a large number of neuroscientists and psychologists to create actually addictive behavior, and which makes you want to keep coming back. But as Osher was saying, it's like eating a substance that has no nutritional value, and you're not ever satisfied, but you keep coming back in the hopes that you'll get satisfied. Now, the interesting thing is, when you were actually communicating through these technologies with actually people it's not a bad thing at all. But it's when you have all these other things that you're trying to connect with that have no necessary meaning that make you feel repeatedly empty. The other aspect is what we know is that by texting or tweeting, compared to maybe speaking on a format like this, compared to in-person interaction, there's a huge difference between the expression of, the love hormone, if you will, oxytocin. And certainly when you have a true personal connection, of course, it's very high. When you're tweeting, it's actually low, although there is something there. So I think that, again, none of these technologies per se are bad, but unfortunately, in a capitalist society, they have one interest, and that is addicting you so that you keep showing up. And that is what's very unhealthy.
But I mean, potato chips are better than nothing if there's nothing else on the table. And this past year and a half, for some people, that has been their main source of social connection. So where's the fine balance there?
I think that, oh, sorry, Jim, I don't know.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that one of the things that I think we're starting to understand in terms of the research is the importance of balance. And balance is the word that you're actually talking about there. There's some interesting work that's been done recently or published recently looking at older people and the contribution of in-person and virtual connections in the context of COVID restrictions. And so what they actually found was that the people who were least lonely, this is in the US as well as in the UK, the people who were least lonely were those who had a good balance of both. The people who were most lonely and had worse, the worst levels of depressive symptomatology were those who were only connecting virtually. And it is the other thing that I thought was really interesting about this. It wasn't the case that just in-person trumped it. So if that were the case, you basically get both in-person and virtual and all in-person trumping it all. But that isn't what happened. So technology is doing a little bit of something there. And, so there is also some other work that we've actually done personally where with older people who are living in residential care, and we were sort of trying to, one of the big issues that comes up, and this was pre-COVID, one of the issues that comes up is that often it's hard to make in-person contact with people when you've got vulnerabilities, when it's difficult for you to get out of the care home because of various restrictions you've got, but also restrictions that people might have coming in. And what we did is we actually trained people up to use technology in order to be able to connect. And when you don't have other means of connection, this was a really important vehicle for people to be able to make those connections in the same way that we've actually been using during COVID itself. I had one of my clever honours students who was working on a project last year when we were in lockdown, but also sort of in that sort of stage of coming out. And prior to COVID restrictions, a lot of the evidence about social media was pretty mixed. So some people felt bullied, didn't feel that there were positive associations with it. Other people felt, it had value. So we had a lot of mixed evidence of its value and its benefits pre-COVID. During this lockdown period, what this student found was that actually all connection was valuable. And that was because we were restricted with connection. So what we do is we need to make the most of what connections we actually have there. And in the context of what, I'm sure is going to be a discussion in ongoing panels, but also with ours, is that it's about using technology appropriately. It's about using technology in balance, I think, and doing better than we currently do, because, what we do already know is that it isn't necessarily floating everybody's boat in the right way. Right.
Now. And Jim, you've talked about your experience of the different relationships you've had, and sometimes it's less about the format and more about the actual quality of the relationship.
Oh yeah. And in some ways, getting back to what Catherine was saying, if you actually have an authentic relationship with somebody, whether it's text, whether it's virtual or in person, it's still meaningful. It's not cocktail chatter. It's actually, you're talking about serious subjects. You're talking about yourself. You feel comfortable sharing versus in some of these situations, you're terrified of being judged. And either on how you look, how you speak, where you're from, et cetera. And so you can't just arbitrarily go out and say, hey, I'm here, guys. It's like walking into a party of people who you don't know anything about. And somehow that's supposed to resonate with you when it terrifies you. So I think, yes, technology is great if there's actually authentic connection, but just going out there in the hopes that you're going to find connection, it can happen certainly. But in general, it's a much more difficult task. Now, I would say also, of course, though, before the pandemic, there was an epidemic of stress, anxiety, depression, and loneliness. So while the pandemic certainly has dramatically increased that, these are not new phenomena. And I think part of it is the evolution of our species in the face of ever-changing technology, as Osher was saying, being the old man that he is, well, he doesn't even change his expression. Maybe he's turned us off. But anyway, I mean, if you come upon this and it's foreign to you, then the very nature of that technology is anxiety provoking. But again, if you spent the time, you've actually connected, you have relationships that you're just transfer into these various technology platforms, I don't think there's necessarily a problem. It's when, though, you feel isolated, where you feel that people don't care about you, when you feel that in yourself you don't have anything to give. I think that is a different type of problem slightly. It's not necessarily the technology that's causing it. It's actually a disorder that technology can actually overcome many times.
Osher, I wanted to ask you about, you've talked about your experience with agoraphobia, which is something that I've heard people talking about after lockdowns, and then when lockdowns lift, this re-entry syndrome. What have you learnt that you'd like to share with people who are feeling this way at the moment?
I think like most things, it's, in my experience, it felt like it was the right thing to do to keep me safe from what was troubling to me, which ended up being, I got diagnosed with social anxiety. Like, there was a reason I didn't want to go out. And it was like a safety strategy, like ducking when you hear a loud noise. But if you're always expecting that there's going to be a loud noise, you walk around crouching down your whole life. So what I thought was making it better was actually making it worse. And the thing that I know now is that I just started to put in an if this, then that kind of thing in my brain. Like, if I get invited out to go to a dinner and I don't want to go, then I have to go. Because if I don't want to go, that's the part of my brain that doesn't work very well. That's the self-protection thing that I know makes me sick. So if I get invited out and I don't want to go, then that's a sign I need to go. And every time I went, it would always be way more awesome than sitting at home doom scrolling through my phone. And that's the kind of hack that I would put into my own behavior, which really helped. Really helped. It allowed me to, both Kath and Jim would probably know about this way and tell me why, but allowed the thinking part of my brain to address the system part of my brain, going, I know you're kind of trying to react to keep me safe here, but I know better. And so I'm just going to drag you kicking and screaming off to this dinner, and we're actually going to have an okay time. And sure enough, we get home tonight. Yeah, thanks, man.
Catherine, I can see you nodding. What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, look, I think that what you're describing there, Osher, in terms of the social anxiety, it's real, and it's been, and as you said, Tegan, it's real for people who are actually coming out of the pandemic, starting to think about, how am I going to relate now? How do I get back some of those skills? And if you felt uncomfortable about those skills before, it's kind of going to exacerbate that discomfort moving out. So I do think that it is this process of trying to sort of get yourself out of that space where you've created a protective bubble in order to be able to get the benefits that you can if you engage in person. So in fact, that's what, part of what we try and do in Groups for Health as well. Everybody's got a choice. Everybody's got a choice to keep on doing things the way that they would like, to stay in that protective bubble, or to keep on doing things that keep them in this way that reduces their social anxiety. But part of the reason for why people raise questions like you have, Osher, and also why people come to our groups, is that they don't want that life to continue. They want things to change. And that motivation is what I think is really key. And different people have different strategies, internal strategies that have just been described here. There are different ways of strategizing to kind of get you out of that space. And sometimes I often think that it isn't just about thinking that I have to do this for myself. Take a buddy, take a friend, thinking, and also recognizing that this isn't something that's just about you as an individual. In fact, there are a number of people, I think, who experience these sorts of thoughts and feelings. And even knowing that, I think, certainly helps start making, edging you away from that kind of safety bubble to break out.
Yeah, safety was a theme that came up in your introduction as well, Jim. I'd love to explore that a bit. What makes a space safe?
Well, one, it's you eliminate the fear of judgment. Everyone has a narrative going on in their head, and loneliness or isolation can certainly exacerbate that, where you'd say, well, the reason people don't want to hang out with me is I'm not good looking, or I'm not funny, or I'm not attractive, et cetera, et cetera. And then you repeat this in your head over and over, and then you say, well, that's truth. And as Catherine pointed out, of course, the sense of isolation and loneliness is very common, but it's constantly beating yourself up that actually then overwhelms you, where you don't want to be around anybody because you expect a negative outcome. So I think techniques that allow you to be kind to yourself or compassionate to yourself and understand that others have very similar feelings and you're not really alone, decreases those feelings. So I think that's a very important aspect. Just to comment on something Catherine was saying, there's a book by a fellow, and I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called How God Works, and it's by a fellow by the name of David Destino, who's at Northeastern, who actually has studied religious rituals minus the religion. And it's amazing how getting people together to do rituals has an incredible ability to connect people. And once you connect, as Osher was saying, your anxiety actually decreases because you're in, if you will, the same boat together. And the very nature of experiencing something with someone else decreases your anxiety.
Is that part of what you're doing with your groups for health, Catherine?
Yeah, look, the people who are coming to our program have been experiencing social disconnection for a fair amount of time. We've been working with people who are presenting with mental health problems in association with loneliness and social disconnection. So people who are experiencing depression. So in a sense, it's learning that you're not alone in this endeavor is really important. That thing about sort of it's almost like a common experience, a shared experience that people actually have. And it's learning with others. So part of the program is about giving people an in vivo group experience with others who felt, this way for some time, or felt disconnected for some time, and using that as a basis to draw on the resources from other people. And as part of doing that, people are also then starting to learn that other people are safe, and that all of these experiences that they may have had in the past, well, some of them may have been related to particular circumstances and events, and moving forward, it doesn't have to be like that. So trying to eliminate that fear. So the groups for health, when people actually join it, is a new group for everybody. So it's really important for us to make it a positive, constructive experience that people actually start learning from each other. And the way I think that the group is actually working most effectively is when people in the group, if I facilitate a group, then the people in the group aren't listening to me anymore. If they're starting to listen to other people, they actually have taken on board the fact that the answer lies in people. The answer lies with the other people out there. And I need to have a little bit more of that. I don't necessarily need to keep on going back to these health professionals. I can empower myself to deal with this. And there are other people that I can seek out who can help me do that.
So if we know that social connection is part of the answer, and we know that technology, for better or worse, is just part of the mix for us from now on, especially at the moment when we're still disconnected, what do we know about what positive ways we can be using technology to help connect us? Jim?
I think we've talked about them already. The bottom line is it has to be authentic. It cannot be manipulative. And you have to overcome your fear of judgment. And I think that's one very positive thing. Interestingly, I've been working on a project to help deal with some of these issues. And this may seem a paradox, but it's actually using a virtual human to connect with people. And that, like I said, that may seem like a strange paradox, but if you look at a number of studies in relationship to avatars, people actually can have a significant connection. And the avatar can actually bring you out of this. So imagine a situation where you may be stressed, anxious, lonely, and you connect with an avatar, which actually has the ability to intuit your emotional state, and then has, if you will, a compassionate engine that then responds to you and guides you through a set of exercises or discussion that, number one, makes you feel comfortable, because again, seeing a therapist for many, the very nature of that creates anxiety. But if it's in the construct of a trusted friend who's just chatting with you, your fear dissipates, and then you're much more able to listen and understand some of the issues which are creating your own anxiety. As an example, we're talking about self-compassion. So imagine you're talking to the avatar and it says, would you mind if we tried this technique? I just want to see what you think of it. And then you go through a series of exercises. And actually, it's extraordinarily powerful. And again, like I said, it may be counterintuitive, but there's a lot of data that demonstrates that this will work.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Jim, because it allows me to seamlessly forward promote to our one of this series is actually about compassion and AI and whether compassionate AI can exist. So stay tuned, folks, for that one coming up in a couple of weeks. But Osha, I wanted to talk to you about you. It sounds like social media has been a source of, maybe not a source of anxiety, but it has fueled your anxiety in the past. Have you had to swear off it completely, or have you found a way to participate without it being overwhelming?
Well, to take a full disclosure, and I'm 11 years sober, so there's a part of my brain that does not want to let go of things. All right, and I have tried to manage in the past with setting my own screen time. I have failed at that dismally. I got to a point where for about 2 years, I made my wife create a screen time passcode in my phone. So even if I wanted to install and watch the app, I couldn't. And that was enormous relief for me. I still access these things on a desktop, but to sit down at a laptop is, it's not like and part of that was just learning how to wait in line. It's something I knew how to do up until 2009. No problem at all. But somehow I lost that ability for a long time. So yeah, I do struggle with it. And I think, you mentioned AI. I think it's really important to understand, and Jim alluded to this earlier. For a work thing, I put Instagram back on my phone now, and it's been back there for a couple of weeks. And the other day, I'm scrolling through things, and it's realized that I've stopped and looked at a photo of a friend of mine, but he's got his shirt off and he's lifting something heavy and he's looking great. And then before I know it, I'm like 2 days later, I'm back on a 16/8 fasting regime, and I'm lifting weights again. I have been fully physically manipulated because I started to see more and more pictures of dudes around my age lifting heavy things with no shirts on. And before I know it, I'm back in my backyard. I've changed the way I'm eating. I'm lifting things heavy again. I'm like, crikey, I've been nudged into behavior that last week I had no intention of doing, and yet here I am doing it. And there's no way that my ability, my free will can cope with an AI engine that is directly influencing everything I'm seeing in my phone. For me, if I want time away from that and want to insulate myself from having decisions made for me, I just got to get off my phone.
You can see how that could be a positive or a negative, this nudging towards positive behaviors or nudging towards negative behaviors. And for different people, what those are different. For some people, that's a healthy change. And for others, that's a spiral into disordered eating or whatever. Catherine, how do we use this technology for good and not for evil?
Look, I think that there are a number of different answers to this, and it's not just one solution. I think that what Osha you were doing in terms of sort of I'm gonna stop these sorts of things, or I'm gonna diarise when I do this, when I engage with media and when I do these other things. I think the danger really comes when, as we were talking about earlier on, when you let it take over. So you need to still maintain that balance. And so I'm going to make sure that I diarise and clock in the other things that I really want to do in my day, not just the stuff that's around technology. Whether it's, and I think that under, balancing that time, working on that time, making sure that you've got a good balance of other things that you're actually doing that isn't just about that social media. So you've got multiple influences in your life, then you can draw on those that are probably going to be more health enhancing or most health enhancing for you. When you're just relying on one source, it's almost like this is the guru, and this is where I'm actually going to get all of my information from. You want to make sure you've got a bit of a diverse source, and I think that that's useful. And that's where I think it's going to be more likely to be healthy, because you're actually putting some control over it. You've actually put some of you into that rather than being led. And I think that that's where things are much more healthy. When you think that things are starting to get out of control, that you're being influenced totally, that you're actually being taken down a particular line, that you're not doing some of the things that really gave you pleasure before, that those sorts of things have actually stopped. I think that they're signals that maybe things aren't working in the way that they should, and it's time to reevaluate and rethink and go back to some of the strategies that people use to contain it.
Jim, you're one of the experts in this area. What about compassion as a theory? How do we apply the compassion theory to this real world experience of loneliness and new technology?
Well, I think I in some ways alluded to this earlier, but again, one of the most disabling aspects of us as humans, and of course this was before there was the internet, is being hypercritical of yourself. And this leads, the very nature of saying you're not good enough, that you can't do X, Y, or Z, limits your possibilities in the real world. Because once you say I can't, by definition, you can't. And this is very isolating for people. And of course, technology has exacerbated this, as I was saying, in terms of people trying to present themselves as perfect, which for them, they know they're not perfect, which creates more problems for themselves. And then for those watching them, it exacerbates them because they think these people are actually perfect. I think when you're kind to yourself, when you are more thoughtful, when you understand that everyone on some level is suffering, everyone on some level is hypercritical, then it makes you see the world through a different lens, a lens that is much more gentle, much more thoughtful, much more kind. And actually, it hopefully reinforces this aspect, which is one that creates community, which is to reach out and try to help other people. And so when you have this authentic desire to be of service, to care, you understand what people are going through, and you actually actively reach out, that can be extraordinarily empowering, because what you also sense is that you have agency. And this is where people get confused, because they think the events that happen in their lives, they have no control over. But in fact, as Catherine was alluding to, we do have control. You just have to understand it and how to approach that. And once you do that, I think that also changes a lot of things. And to be self-serving here, actually, there's a book that I'm just finishing up, which is, it's called Mind Magic, the Neuroscience of Manifestation and How It Changes Everything. And in some ways, this empowers you by showing you how you can change how you think, and how you can actually have your own agency to create sort of the vision of how you wish to be, not be manipulated by a lot of your surroundings, including, of course, technology.
You mentioned before neuroplasticity. Is it the case that if unchecked, loneliness just begets more loneliness?
Well, again, what can happen is once you start down that track, which essentially what makes people lonely is, again, I think fear of judgment, that they're going to go someplace and nobody's going to like them or comment on their dress or how overweight they are or whatever it is. And then, of course, that creates this whole component of now your heart starts beating faster. You're, afraid to go out. You think all of these issues are going to occur, this catastrophizing, and which again are all false narratives. It's funny because you'll see somebody who, may not be particularly physically attractive, may have a strange accent, all these other things, yet they're able to just go out and have a great time and not care. And you sit there and go, how do they do that? Don't they know people are judging them? Well, they've learned to accept themselves and not care. And I think this is the key, is acceptance of who you are. And none of us are perfect, and all of us have shadows, and that's the human condition. And when you're able to sit there and say, look, I am who I am, and you either like it or you don't, but how you feel about me doesn't change how I feel about myself.
We're going to wrap up pretty soon, but I'd love to end by just sort of getting some reflections. Osha, if you're talking to someone who's struggling with this at the moment, what do you have to say to them?
Well, a part of it starts with what Jim was just mentioning is there can be a great sense of that you have no agency over what's going on. If you start focusing on the things you can control how much you sleep, you can control what and when and how you eat, you can control how much you move your body. Start getting those things dialed in. It'll give you a far better and more stable base for which to do these brave things that Kat's talking about, is to take a breath, put your big boy pants on and go out and, see someone and start early. You don't have to go out and have a 12-seater dinner party straight away. Start with a phone call. Pick up and have a phone call. What's the smallest incremental step you can take towards a face-to-face interaction again? That's it. And just give yourself, it doesn't even have to be long. Spend 3 minutes on the phone, and then tomorrow spend 5. Just incrementally increasing it, challenging yourself a little bit more every day. You'd be astonished how quickly and how wonderfully you will start to adapt and feel better, and also feel a lot of agency within yourself by taking those steps.
Yeah, Catherine, what does a better, less lonely future, what could it look like?
Oh, look, as I've been saying throughout, I think it's a good balance between all the different ways to connect. It's a bit of social snacking along the lines of, like having those micro interactions. We missed a lot of those during COVID. Remember, we used to have all of those during workplaces and down the corridor. A lot of that stuff was actually holding people. That's good to have some of that, but you also need to have a lot of those meaningful connections as well. And it isn't just about one meaningful connection, it's about multiple connections. What we actually know from the science is that people who are more connected, and particularly if people who are more connected with groups that have a positive influence in their lives, family groups, community groups, art-based groups, interest groups, whatever it is that floats people's boat. These are guys who actually tend to manage challenges better, tend to cope with life changes that we experience throughout life, whether they're positive or negative, much better. And they seem to be healthier, happier, and live longer. So I think it's a good, thinking about investing in how you connect, in the different ways that you connect. And those different ways to connect are all okay. So it's about finding the connections that are meaningful for you. And if you don't have that meaning, that's where things kind of sort of fall down.
Jim, what's some positive structural changes that you'd like to see here?
Well, I think as we're discussing, I think this idea of nudging with your self-agency is very important, and also accepting yourself. But one of the challenges, though, that separates us is narratives that are either pushed by technology or, as you know, sometimes politicians, and then they create this separation between us. And of course, the reality is, if you look at us, almost all of us, our positive desires are about 90% that overlap. And it's these issues that some people make the center point of how they're going to interact, which actually are not relevant at all. And I think giving people a benefit of the doubt and accepting them and looking through the lens of compassion and understand that everyone is suffering, and simply being gentle and nice. And when you are kind and compassionate, you look through that lens, actually your physiology dramatically improves. So you're actually releasing hormones that makes you feel good. So when you can actually look out versus focused in and being critical, when you can look out and understand that we're all human and we're all suffering, and it is within your power to improve the life of another. And I think that's really a critical aspect, is that when you switch the narrative to say from, oh, I'm so lonely, life sucks, to say, God, everybody's lonely. I'm going to go out and help people be less lonely, or I'm going to communicate with this person, or I'm going to give this person the 3-minute call that I've been, avoiding for a while. But then you do it and you go, wow, that felt great to connect with them. And I'm sure they were lonely too. And so I think those types of actions where you're outwardly interacting, even though it's hard, actually you find from a physiologic point of view has a dramatic effect, which then goes to, if you want to call it, a virtual cycle of improving your own mental health.
Jim Doty, Catherine Haslam, Osher Günsberg, thank you so much all for sharing today.
Thanks for having us.
It's wonderful. I appreciate it.
That's it for this week's discussion. Please join us again next week when we will be exploring thorny issues around online trolls and cyberbullying. My guests then will be award-winning social justice journalist Ginger Gorman, New Zealand judge and expert in communications technology law David Harvey, and medical philosopher focusing on the well-being of marginalised people Brian McCarthy. That's all from Compassion and the New Technologies for this week. Thank you to our production team, Alistair Foster, James Kirby, and Pascal Berger. I'm Tegan Taylor. See you next week.